A wall of mud and debris tore through the Arizona desert today. Some folks had to jump out of its path and barely escape.
For nearly a century, in a hot, dry canyon in Arizona, there stood a concrete wall about 25 feet high. It was not one of the massive dams that usually appear on maps of the United States, but every minute, that small structure pulled roughly 20,000 gallons of water from a desert creek, sent the flow into channels running along the mountainside, and carried it toward turbines that generated electricity. Below the dam, what had once been a powerful stream was reduced to a thin ribbon of water. Turquoise pools gradually became warmer and turned green with algae. Natural rock terraces stopped growing. Many native fish species were pushed into smaller and smaller pockets of water, while non-native species began to take over. That situation continued for 96 years. Then, on a morning in June 2005, the diversion gates were shut. For the first time since 1909, almost all the water coming from the headwater springs was once again allowed to flow through the creek bed it had originally created. Ecologists had been waiting for that moment for years, but no one knew exactly what would happen. How long would an ecosystem that had lost most of its water for nearly a century need to recover? A few decades? A generation? Or had some of the damage become permanent? And if you simply gave the water back, would nature actually know how to rebuild itself? What the monitoring equipment recorded afterward did more than change the way people thought about Fossil Creek. It raised a much bigger question about hundreds of rivers and aging dams across the American West. A creek that can build its own rock. As you come around the final bend on the road leading down to Fossil Creek, it can feel like you have suddenly entered a place that does not belong in Arizona. Between dry slopes, red rock, desert shrubs, agave, and air shimmering in the heat, a ribbon of turquoise water runs along the bottom of the canyon. Its color looks more like rivers flowing through limestone country in Europe than a creek in the American Southwest. The canyon is so deep that, according to the way the source material describes it, you could stack several statues of Liberty on top of one another and still have room left above them. But the unusual appearance is only the most obvious part. What truly makes Fossil Creek special is hidden in the water itself. The name Fossil Creek might make you think of fossils, but many of the fossil-like objects people once noticed in this area were actually branches, leaves, and rocks coated in a pale layer of minerals. Water from fossil springs contains a large amount of dissolved calcium. As the water moves, especially where the current slows down, some of those minerals come out of solution and precipitate as travertine. A leaf falling into calm water can slowly become encased in stone. A branch lying across the current can become the foundation for a new mineral ridge. Over generations, that process created a series of travertine terraces along the creek bed, almost like small natural dams one after another, with a pool forming behind each one. And the process is still happening today. Around 13 tons of new travertine can form along Fossil Creek every single day. Not over thousands of years combined. Every day. That extraordinary rate makes this the fourth largest travertine system in the United States. In other words, this is not simply water flowing over rock. It is a creek that is constantly rebuilding its own channel. And for that geological machine to keep working, it needs one thing above all else: a steady flow of water. That seemingly simple characteristic is exactly what turned Fossil Creek from a natural wonder into an attractive source of energy in the early 20th century. Springs that do not seem to know what drought is. Almost everything that happens at Fossil Creek begins with a group of springs near the base of the canyon. The water does not depend mainly on melting snow or seasonal rainfall. It rises out of the rock, supplied by an aquifer with a recharge and discharge cycle so long that modern human history looks like little more than a brief moment by comparison. From these springs, roughly 20,000 gallons of water emerge every minute. In the units hydrologists commonly use, the flow is about 43 cubic feet per second. But the most remarkable thing is not simply the amount of water. It is the consistency. Fossil Springs keeps flowing during wet years, during dry years, and even through severe droughts in the Southwest. The water temperature also stays around 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit in both summer and winter. Put that in the context of Arizona, and the difference becomes obvious. Many waterways in the region change dramatically with the seasons. They may rise in spring, begin shrinking in May, and by the middle of summer, all that remains may be isolated pools scattered across a dry, cracked channel. In the desert, a lack of water is usually the normal condition. Fossil Creek almost seems to operate by a different set of rules. That constant flow created a green corridor of vegetation through otherwise harsh terrain. More than 30 species of trees and shrubs grow along the banks, including cottonwood, sycamore, willow, and ash. More than 100 bird species have been recorded moving through the area each year. For ecologists who studied the creek later, its stability also offered a rare scientific advantage. When a natural system has a relatively steady baseline, changing a single factor leaves behind a much clearer signal. But long before anyone thought of Fossil Creek as a place to study ecology, someone else looked at that same water and saw energy. In 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner filed a claim for the right to use the creek's water. A year later, he filed additional claims covering the springs and headwaters. Under the water laws of the American West at the time, a steady flow of 20,000 gallons per minute could effectively become an individual's right to develop and use. And at exactly that moment, mining towns in central Arizona needed electricity more than ever. When a creek became a power plant, Jerome, Clark, and Crown King were growing. Ore hoists, crushers, smelters, electric lights, and industrial equipment all needed power. But there was no modern electrical grid that people could simply plug into. Under those conditions, Fossil Creek was not viewed only as a scenic place. A constant flow of water moving through a canyon with an elevation drop of roughly 1,600 feet represented a source of energy waiting to be used. The problem was getting the equipment there. The nearest railroad station was more than 40 miles from the construction area on the other side of mountainous terrain and deep canyons, and there was no real road leading to the planned power plant site. So before the hydroelectric system could even be built, the project first needed a way to reach it. More than 600 workers and over 400 mules helped move roughly 150 wagon loads through terrain that was almost completely undeveloped. A road was cut into the mountainside, rock was blasted where necessary, and sections were reinforced wherever the slopes became too steep. Many Apache and Mojave people were among the laborers, working on land their communities had traveled through for generations. And the cargo they were moving was not light material that could easily be broken into small pieces. It included turbines, generators, cast iron components, and tons of cement. Heavy machinery was disassembled at the railhead, transported more than 40 miles, and then reassembled at the bottom of the canyon. But reaching the canyon rim still was not the hardest part. The loads then had to be lowered across an elevation difference of around 1,600 feet. In terrain like that, a wagon could not simply roll downhill. Equipment was controlled using ropes, pulley systems, and teams of workers standing above who managed each stage of the descent, while people below waited to receive the load. Some components took almost an entire day just to lower into position. During summer, temperatures at the bottom of the canyon could rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. People died along that route. Animals did too. Some accidents involved falls, others involved extreme heat, and some deaths simply belonged to an era when workplace safety was nothing like it is today. Most of the names that survived in historical records belong to engineers, not to the people who physically carried the materials into the canyon. A bond issue raised about $1.5 million, an enormous amount of money at the time. Finally, on the 21st of June 1909, the Childs Power Plant began operating. Between 1915 and 1916, the Irving plant was added. And to keep both plants running, Fossil Creek had to be completely transformed. A 25-foot wall and a city hundreds of miles away. Water was diverted into roughly 8,800 feet of flume running along the canyon wall, leaving the natural creek bed before dropping toward the turbines. Near the springs, engineers built a dam about 25 feet high. It did not simply take a portion of the creek, it captured almost all of it. At the time, there were strong reasons to see the system as a major achievement. By around 1920, the Childs and Irving plants were supplying nearly 70% of the electricity used by the rapidly growing city of Phoenix. A creek located far from the city helped light streets, power streetcars, and support some of the first air conditioning systems appearing in the Salt River Valley. Fossil Creek did not provide Phoenix with drinking water. It provided energy by spinning turbines. From an engineering point of view, the project did exactly what it had been designed to do. But a few hundred yards below the dam, a completely different story was unfolding. If you had walked into the canyon below the dam decades later, the first thing you might have noticed was the imbalance. The creek bed was broad, rocky, and clearly shaped by a flow of around 43 cubic feet per second. Yet through the middle of that channel ran only a tiny ribbon of water, sometimes just 1 or 2 cubic feet per second. The channel still looked like it belonged to a real river, but the water inside it looked like the leftovers. And when the volume of water dropped, temperature was one of the first things to change. Deep, continuously moving water is harder to heat than shallow, slow-moving water. Pools that had once received water at around 70 degrees Fahrenheit began warming under the afternoon sun. Algae thrived in the warmer, brighter environment, gradually changing the clear turquoise color into green. Mud and sediment that stronger currents would normally have carried away now settled on the bottom, covering the bright mineral surface. Then travertine formation began to weaken as well. The system that had once produced around 13 tons of rock every day no longer had enough flowing water to function as before. Old mineral terraces dried along the edges, cracked, and turned pale. But the most serious change was taking place beneath the surface, a river that became a shadow of itself. Several native fish species in Fossil Creek had evolved around a very specific set of conditions: relatively stable temperatures, continuous flow, calcium-rich water, and pools shaped by travertine. As their habitat shrank, they did not have some large alternative area where they could simply move. They were forced into the few places that still held enough water. Higher densities in smaller spaces made reproduction more difficult, increased the risk of disease, and made the fish easier for predators to reach. Meanwhile, non-native fish that had been introduced elsewhere in the watershed began moving into Fossil Creek. Ironically, the environment weakened by human activity suited them extremely well. The water was warmer, the current was slower, pools became more fragmented. Invasive fish preyed on native species or competed with them for food and space. In the small amount of water left below the diversion system, they gradually became dominant. This continued through much of the 20th century. A creek famous for its ability to turn water into stone had been reduced to a faded version of itself, while the power system above it continued to be celebrated as an engineering achievement. Yet what eventually changed everything did not begin with the fish, the travertine, or some massive environmental campaign. It began with economics. By the 1990s, Childs and Irving had become very old power plants. Childs had been operating since the administration of President Taft. More importantly, Phoenix had changed completely. A city in 1920 could receive most of its electricity from one creek in a canyon. Phoenix in 1995 could not. The amount of electricity that had once represented nearly 70% of the city's demand had become a tiny fraction of a much larger modern electrical grid. At the same time, maintaining the system was becoming increasingly expensive. Renewing the license for a nearly century-old hydroelectric facility meant environmental reviews, mitigation measures, and equipment upgrades in a canyon that was extremely difficult to access. Arizona Public Service, which owned the plants at the time, recalculated the entire equation. And in 1999, the company agreed to shut down Childs and Irving and return the full flow of Fossil Creek to its natural channel. No court forced the company to do it. There was no ruling ordering the removal of the system. The company voluntarily gave up water rights that had once been enormously valuable. In the American West, where states can fight over even relatively small amounts of water, and where water rights form the foundation of an entire legal system, voluntarily giving back around 20,000 gallons per minute was extraordinarily rare. But shutting the gates was never the entire plan. Do things in the wrong order, and the whole project could fail. The restoration effort cost around $13 million. And a very natural question came up: why spend that much money to save fish species that have almost no commercial value? Species such as sucker, dace, or roundtail chub do not support a major sport fishing industry. Nobody builds a local economy around catching speckled dace. That made Fossil Creek a particularly interesting restoration case because the main goal was to restore the ecosystem for the value of the ecosystem itself. At the ceremony marking the shutdown, Vincent Randall, a historian and council member of the Yavapai Apache community, stood on the canyon rim. The ancestors of Apache and Mojave people had once helped carry equipment, cement, and turbines into the canyon to build the very system that took the water away from the creek. That project had once been a source of pride in human labor and engineering skill. But its time had passed. Randall asked Fossil Creek for forgiveness. It was a powerful symbolic moment. Ecologically, however, the hardest part was still ahead. If engineers had simply shut down the flume and released all the water immediately, the project could actually have produced the opposite of what they wanted. By 2004, the stretch below the dam contained large numbers of non-native fish. Restoring the water before dealing with those fish would have given those invasive species a larger, deeper, cooler, and more stable habitat. In other words, $13 million could have been spent creating a perfect environment for exactly the species the project was trying to remove. So the order of operations became critical. In the fall of 2004, nearly 100 people descended into the canyon. They came from the Forest Service, Arizona Game and Fish, Northern Arizona University, research organizations, and volunteer groups. There was no convenient road following the creek. Equipment had to be carried in on foot, by pack animal, or by helicopter. Teams worked section by section, moving upstream, treating one area and then keeping it separated from the next. They stood in the water for hours, pulling nets and sorting individual fish by hand, deciding which species would remain and which had to be removed. Downstream, a barrier was built that allowed water to continue flowing while preventing non-native fish from swimming back into the restoration zone. Concrete and steel once again had to be brought into a place where transportation had never been easy. The logic of the entire campaign can be reduced to 3 steps. Remove the species that do not belong in the ecosystem. Block their route back in. Only then restore the water. By the following spring, the barrier was still holding. Most of the non-native fish in the target section had been removed. Research equipment was ready. There was now only one variable nobody could control: the river itself. The morning of June 18, 2005. On the 18th of June 2005, Arizona Public Service stopped diverting water into the flume system. For the first time since 1909, the full force of Fossil Springs was allowed to move through the old creek bed. But what happened did not look like the dramatic dam removals people often imagine. There was no enormous wall of water exploding through the canyon. There was no violent impact or single cinematic moment that could become an iconic image. Around 20,000 gallons per minute sounds like an incredible amount of water, but that flow had to spread across a wide, dry, gravel-filled channel that had been deprived of water for multiple human generations. The water moved slowly. The leading edge crept through depressions between rocks at roughly walking speed, sometimes even slower. It reached dry gravel and disappeared as the soil and stone absorbed it, then reappeared farther downstream. Small side channels that had been dry for decades began filling from below. Shallow pools full of warm water and green algae received cooler water at one end, while the old water was gradually pushed out the other. Rocks that had been dry, white, and faded became bright again when they got wet. Color began returning to the creek bed. Jane Marks, along with scientists, agency employees, and local residents, walked through the canyon beside the advancing edge of the water. Sometimes they moved ahead of it, sat on rocks, and waited for the water to reach them. For many people, it looked like watching a river come home. For the research team, it was also the beginning of a full-scale natural experiment, and they had an extremely rare advantage. Marks' team had monitored Fossil Creek for years before the water was restored. They measured water chemistry, nutrient processing, photosynthesis, fish populations, travertine formation rates, and many other indicators describing how an ecosystem functioned when it was receiving only about 2% of its natural flow. More importantly, they had a control section. Above the diversion point was a part of Fossil Creek that had never lost its water. It still received the natural flow from the same springs with the same chemical composition. So the question was no longer something vague, like, does the creek look better? It became something measurable. How quickly was the restored section becoming similar to the healthy section upstream? Most predictions at the time were cautious. A system deprived of water for 96 years might need decades, perhaps even a full generation, to return to anything close to its former condition. But within a single season, the data began moving in a direction the researchers had not expected. 96 years of damage, but not 96 years to recover. Basic ecosystem processes began increasing almost immediately. Photosynthesis recovered in the restored creek. Nutrient processing, one of the signs that this was a functioning ecosystem rather than simply a ditch with water moving through it, began approaching levels measured in the healthy upstream sections. Not after decades, during the very first seasons. That suggested a very different way of understanding what 96 years of water diversion had actually done. The system had not completely lost its ability to function. Many of its components were still there: microorganisms, algae, invertebrates, the underlying water chemistry, and the basic metabolic processes of the ecosystem. It was more like a machine that had been deprived of its fuel than a machine that had been completely taken apart. When the water returned, a significant portion of the system simply began working again. That does not mean every kind of environmental damage can be reversed. An extinct species does not just reappear. An ecosystem that has been completely destroyed may no longer have the foundation necessary for recovery. But Fossil Creek showed that, at least in the case of a diverted stream, if the original water source and many of the core ecological components are still present, the damage may be more like long-term suppression than permanent destruction. After the chemistry and biological processes recovered, the rock began coming back too. Travertine formation had almost stopped in the dewatered section. Once full flow returned, mineral precipitation increased again. New rock terraces began forming along roughly 6 miles below the springs. In some locations, they grew by more than 2 centimeters per year, fast enough for researchers to mark a point on the rock, come back the following season, and visibly see the difference. The turquoise pools behind those travertine terraces became deeper. As the mineral ridges continued growing, they trapped more water, created new pools, and improved the structure of the habitat. This is where the idea of restoration becomes especially interesting. People did not rebuild every pool. Nobody poured concrete to create new terraces. Nobody manufactured travertine and placed it back into the creek. People removed invasive fish, built a barrier, and restored the water. Fossil Creek did the rest using the same natural processes it had been using before 1909. But if the return of the rock surprised scientists, the numbers from the fish populations were even harder to believe. Numbers that look like a data error. After non-native species were removed, the downstream barrier prevented them from returning, and natural flow was restored. Native fish did not simply increase in number. Some populations grew so dramatically that the results could almost look like someone had misread the data. Sonora sucker increased by about 17 times. Desert sucker increased by around 52 times. Round-tailed chub, a species that had come close to disappearing from the area, increased by roughly 70 times. And speckled dace, a small native fish that had almost vanished from the canyon, increased on the order of 150 times. Put that final number into perspective. A population that had been hovering near disappearance increased more than 100-fold in only a few years. Those fish were not brought in by the thousands from somewhere else. They were not the product of a large hatchery stocking program. They were the descendants of fish that had survived during the period when the creek was nearly depleted, now reproducing inside a habitat that had suddenly expanded. The water was deeper. Temperatures were more stable. Travertine pools returned. Non-native competitors and predators had been removed from the restored section. Today, according to the data in the source material, Fossil Creek contains 9 native fish species and has a distinction that no other river section in Arizona can easily match. It is the longest stretch of river in the state, with an entirely native fish community and no non-native fish species. The recovery did not stop below the surface either. The restored ecological corridor now supports nearly 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. In just the roughly 50-acre vegetation zone surrounding the headwater springs, researchers recorded 166 plant species. A place whose flow had been almost completely removed for much of the 20th century once again became one of the most remarkable pockets of biodiversity in the Southwest. But that success created an entirely new problem. Fossil Creek became too attractive when the river was saved from the dam, only to need saving from the crowd. In 2009, the United States Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as part of the Wild and Scenic River System. It became one of only 2 rivers in Arizona to receive that level of protection. The designation made sense. But Fossil Creek's growing reputation also pushed the area into a different kind of crisis. A turquoise creek with comfortable water temperatures in the middle of a hot, dry plateau is extremely hard to keep secret. Photos spread. More and more people came. During busy periods, thousands of visitors began pouring into the canyon. The narrow access road, which follows the shape of the canyon, quickly became a bottleneck. Cars lined the shoulders. At times, emergency vehicles had difficulty getting through. And in terrain where every rescue operation is already complicated, blocking access can become a serious problem. Direct impacts on the creek began to appear as well. Stream banks were trampled bare around the easiest pools to reach. Trash accumulated faster than volunteers could remove it. Human waste became a concern for water quality. It was an almost perfect contradiction. Fossil Creek had survived nearly a century of having its water diverted for electricity. It survived the period when non-native fish dominated the ecosystem. It was restored at a cost of around $13 million. And then the beauty created by that restoration began attracting enough people to create a completely different form of pressure. Not because people wanted to destroy the place, because too many people wanted to enjoy it. The Forest Service responded with a permit system and gradually tightened access. During peak season, visitors have to reserve entry in advance through the federal recreation system. One permit applies to one vehicle, one designated parking area, and one specific day. The number of permits is far lower than the number of people who once crowded into the canyon. Popular dates can fill up very quickly. Without a permit, drivers may be turned around before they ever reach the water. Random roadside parking is prohibited. Camping is restricted. Rangers patrol the area. It is not the romantic image people usually associate with nature conservation. It is reservations, vehicle limits, and controlled access. But after saving a creek from being drained, managers did not want to watch the recovery get damaged simply because too many people loved the place. And this is where the story of Fossil Creek begins to reach far beyond one canyon in Arizona. What Fossil Creek really proves. There are at least 3 major lessons in this story. The first is speed. Researchers had prepared themselves for a recovery process measured in decades. Instead, some basic ecosystem functions came back within just a few seasons. That does not prove every damaged river will respond the same way Fossil Creek did, but it does show that estimates of recovery time can sometimes underestimate how quickly a natural system can respond when its underlying conditions are still intact. The second lesson is the order in which things are done. Water was necessary, but water alone was not enough. If managers had restored the flow before removing the non-native fish and building the downstream barrier, the improving habitat might actually have helped invasive species expand more rapidly. So one of the most important decisions in the entire project was not the moment the diversion was shut down in June 2005. It came months earlier when nearly 100 people stood in the water, pulled nets, and sorted fish one by one through the canyon. The third lesson is less comfortable. Fossil Creek was not restored simply because the moral argument suddenly became more powerful. The creek had been suffering for decades before a restoration decision was made. What changed near the end of the 20th century was the economic calculation. The power plants had become too old. Their electrical output had become insignificant compared with the size of the modern grid. Relicensing and upgrading the facilities was expensive. When maintenance costs increased while the energy benefit decreased, shutting the system down became the more reasonable option. In other words, the ecological argument had existed for a long time. But the gates were actually closed when the ecological argument finally lined up with the economic one. That detail matters because Fossil Creek is not the only place with aging infrastructure. Across the American West, there are dams and water control systems built in an era with very different needs, technologies, and environmental standards from today. Not all of them should be removed. Not every ecosystem will recover, like Fossil Creek. And not every dam has lost its economic purpose, but Fossil Creek demonstrates a possibility worth considering. Sometimes the first step toward recovery is not building another complicated system. Sometimes it is simply stopping the thing that prevents the natural system from doing its own work. The springs just keep flowing. There is another way to look at this entire story. The springs at the headwaters of Fossil Creek seem almost indifferent to everything humans have done around them. They were flowing before Lou Turner filed his water right claim in 1900. They kept flowing while hundreds of workers and mule trains hauled turbines, generators, and cement into the canyon. They flowed when Childs began generating electricity in 1909. They flowed when Irving was added a few years later. They flowed during the period when roughly 70% of Phoenix's electricity was connected to this system, and they kept flowing even when most of their water was diverted into 8,800 feet of flume instead of being allowed to follow the natural creek bed. For 96 years, the water source never disappeared. The water was simply sent down a different path. Then it flowed through the shutdown ceremony, through Vincent Randall's request for forgiveness, through the campaign to remove non-native fish, through the downstream barrier, and through the morning of the 18th of June, 2005, when the water began finding its way back into gaps between rocks that had been dry for decades. It kept flowing as scientists discovered that photosynthesis and nutrient processing recovered faster than expected. It flowed as new layers of travertine began thickening by more than 2 centimeters per year in some places. It flowed as the speckled dace population increased by roughly 150 times. And that water continues to flow at around 20,000 gallons per minute, at a temperature close to 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, doing what it had been doing long before humans built the first dam here, turning water into rock, and turning a dry canyon into a corridor of life. Perhaps the most remarkable part is that people did not directly create most of that recovery. Nobody manually manufactured new schools of fish. Nobody rebuilt every travertine pool. Nobody placed every plant species back into exactly the right position to reconstruct the streamside corridor. People did a few very specific things. They removed fish that did not belong in the ecosystem, built a barrier to stop them from returning, stopped diverting the water, and then allowed Fossil Creek to continue doing its own work. A concrete wall that had once helped power a growing city had completed its historical role. But the cost had been a creek forced to survive for nearly a century with only a tiny fraction of its natural water. When that finally ended, scientists expected a long recovery. Instead, the water found its old channel. Travertine began growing again. Turquoise pools returned. Ecological functions recovered during the first seasons. Fish species that had once been close to disappearing increased by dozens of times, and in some cases by more than 100-fold. Fossil Creek did not turn back time. A century of history cannot be erased by closing a valve. The power plants that once helped build Phoenix are still part of the story. The workers who died along the transportation route are still part of the story. The indigenous communities with a long history connected to the canyon are still part of the story. But after everything that happened, what Fossil Creek shows us may be simpler than any engineering project ever built here. Sometimes nature does not need people to rebuild everything. Sometimes it only needs us to give back what was taken away. And when roughly 20,000 gallons of water per minute were once again allowed to follow the path geology had created for them, an ecosystem suppressed for 96 years did not need another 96 years to respond. It began almost immediately. If stories about places that seem permanently changed but still have the ability to come back make you want to take a closer look at the world around you, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And what do you think? With aging dams across the American West that no longer provide the value they once did, should we remove more of them and return rivers to their natural state? Or do the costs and the benefits these dams still provide make keeping them the more reasonable choice?